Welcome to the Books Cafe, your literature program on KBC English Service. I'm your host, Khainga O'Okwemba. The Books Cafe is a cutting-edge program in the world of literature where we talk to writers and explore contemporary literary issues. Today, we bring you the second part of a special series of the Books Cafe on the life and career of the legendary photojournalist Sir Mohinder Dhillon, now 85, in 2016. His memory is as sharp, a warm, delighting, and astonishing raconteur. Sir Mohinder Dhillon has just published his 3-volume memoir, My Camera, My Life, one of the most extraordinarily evocative memoirs ever to be written. Sir Mohinder has covered some of the most significant and historic events in modern history. Sir Mohinder witnessed the wind of change sweep hitherto ordinary men into office as presidents of new independent African countries. Did these politicians live to the expectations of the masses? Sir Mohinder's camera is trained on Jomo Kenyatta, Julius Nyerere, Milton Obote, Joseph Kasavubu, Siad Barre, Idi Amin, Gaffer Numeri, Muammar Gaddafi, and Robert Mugabe. He was official photographer of Liberian President William Tubman, whom we miss as a committed Pan-Africanist. Sir Mohinder's illuminating account of Ethiopia's Emperor Haile Selassie as his official photographer and a documentary maker of 8 years is a biography tome. A few people know anything about the larger-than-life emperor. What caused Emperor Haile Selassie's downfall? Sir Mohinder's memoir is not a personal story. His life is a mere glimpse into local and international politics. It is the story of ordinary people, of leaders, good and evil. Told under the backdrop of the Cold War era, Sir Mohinder's memoir is a reposite to the criminal mission of the West in the Congo, the plundering and looting of Congo's vast minerals and gung-ho foreign mercenaries, massacres. Moise Shombe, the quisling blue-eyed boy, was embedded in the criminal activities of notorious Irish mercenary kingpin Mike Hoare. Hoare has written about his exploits. So has Sir Mohinder's colleague, veteran war correspondent Hans Germany, in his book White Soldiers in Black Africa. Stay tuned as we bring you part 2 of this special series of the Books Cafe with the gentle giant of television journalism. Welcome to the Books Cafe, Sir Mohinder Dhillon. You actually meeting other journalists, and that's how you met this amazing friend of yours, Ivo Davis. Tell us something about this gentleman.
I was taking pictures in the beginning. I mean, I've been covering the historical events in this country, like Mau Mau and other things. And at the time, my only outlet was East African Standard. And all the pictures went to them. Later on, I thought I can see the overseas people covering this thing. I said, why don't I send the pictures to overseas newspaper? They didn't pay much, but they gave me a bit of a cake to see my pictures used in British national newspapers, etc. So I got encouraged. The money wasn't much, and then I got married to Ambi. And then I was hardly meeting my expenses, but then when Ambi got married, she started taking passport pictures. This is the British Army who were fighting the Mau Mau rebellion they needed all kind of pictures, and then one day a British Army major come to the office and he asked Ambi to take a nice picture, not a general passport kind of a picture looking straight at the camera, the horrible little passport, make me look a little nicer. So Ambi gave him a backlighting and make him sit at an angle looking over his shoulder. He's very impressed, and he says, I'm actually purchasing officer, and I'm going to send you all the ID pictures, passport pictures, and so many requirements there that my little Halley studio in the Nairobi House office, the oldest building in Nairobi, which people used to come and see. What a fantastic place. It's historically protected by the Archives Act or whatever they are.
Where was this office?
The office was on Moi Avenue, opposite Barclays Bank, on the corner of the Government Road, which is now Moi Avenue, and Delamere Avenue, which is now Harambe Avenue, and it was on that corner, and the building came down because of corruption. And
such a historical.
I got so upset. I went round to the Nation editorial room one day. I said, "Aren't you people going to do anything about this thing?" And they all looked at me. Nobody said a word. I walked out. That's when I started feeling that the media in this country is no longer free.
Ivor Davis, of course, you had met this amazing Jewish lady, Edith Heller, who gave you your first job as a photojournalist. And then eventually you're actually working for her studio, the Hell Studio, which you eventually bought. But things were happening very fast because eventually you became friends with Ivor Davis, he had actually been working with the London Fleet Street, newspaper. And then he moved to Africa, to Kenya in the 1950s. But he was always not very comfortable. He felt he was upset somehow, with what was happening in the newsroom, the Standard newspaper. So he quit, and together, he quit in 1960, and together the two of you actually formed Africa Peaks at the time when so many things were happening in Africa in 1961. Yes, Africa Peaks, the origins.
Ivor Davis was actually a godsend to me because he was a very good journalist and he knew what makes news. I had no idea, being Fleet Street. He was actually in charge of... He actually trained another great journalist called Brian, what was his name? Brian
Tetley.
Brian Tetley. Brian Tetley was considered, he was brilliant, but Ivor Davis was above him. So we didn't have nothing to compare. And he could type out captions, not much. And he had a lot of initiative, which the standard people really didn't want to, and who's a rebel, they almost treating him like missionaries under the British. The British government was against missionaries. So why are they educating them? One day they will get educated and demand independence. So Ivor Davis took the gamble and he came and joined me. He didn't look back. He was very enterprising. He also started doing PR, public relations, which he was very good at. Not that he could write a very good copy. He was very persevering, being a news hound. He impressed his clients. So in the beginning, Africa Peaks could not afford much to pay, but then I was also doing other things and he was also doing other things. It worked. And then came the speech by Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, who said, "The wind of change is sweeping through Africa." And it was also sweeping through our operation as well. So it came at the right time when the Lancaster House conference happened. These people came and there were a lot of activities. Then came Kanu, racing, and we were even the Kadu delegate were sent to meet Kenyatta. We were dying to get a picture of Kenyatta. Ivor Davis even went with the Daily Express man once into the bush. He was not a photographer, but there were roadblocks everywhere. The British were keeping him out of touch with the rest of the world. Nobody had seen Jomo Kenyatta. But we defeated the British government. we gave our camera to Cindy Muliro and Ronald Ngala, who were the first people to go to visit
Jomo
Kenyatta.
Just before his release.
Just came the pictures. And there was the rest of the media. Nobody thought of this. Only people like Ivor Davis and myself would think of that, because when you are a dedicated person, you have a subject. The secret in this business is if you are something on your mind, you're thinking it all the time. under the shower, sitting on a toilet, and while any moment. And so the idea came, and that we will give a camera to these two. And I gave them the camera, Canon camera, and put and locked it up with the sellotape, gave them the film, and say approximately stand at 15 feet, and just like we gave a 36 exposure film, and they brought us film. That was the first big scoop about the Africa pigs. And there we are, and that was how it got started.
Oh, you're right.
And I don't know if you want to enlarge me what happened that Jacinto's daughter. And years later, I mean, we gave obviously Maliro and Ngala some
of the photos,
books, speeches of Winston Churchill, and the other one was another one, not a Churchill, another book, for an ideal for politician. They were very grateful. We gave them big enlargements, and Maliro's daughter one day appeared at my house to thank me. I said, you don't have to thank me for those pictures. I have to thank your father being able to take the pictures and etc. We become very good friends. He was at the launch of my book, and there's a beautiful picture. At the launch of the book, there is an exhibition as well, which is now being shown at the museum.
At the museum.
And,
now, yes.
And she came here. He said, he gave me a big hug. You made my father a hero once again. There's a picture of Liro, Ngala, and Martin Shikuku. On the top, there's a Cardo. It's a beautiful picture. And so this is how the world goes on. And I was identified with the movement at any rally, etc. I went. People were so good to me.
You're right. Now, you actually just given some insight into how you got that very first important photo of Jomo Kenyatta, because he had actually been jailed for those about 9 years, and many people did not know, how he looked like. He had actually been lost to the public limelight. But then, knowing that you'd not be allowed, because you actually say there that your friend Ivor Davis had actually tried to go there with somebody else, they were denied entry. They didn't, but eventually you actually worked around the strategy, and you got that scoop of a photo of Jomo Kenyatta, and people were able to see how he looked like and expect him just before his release. Now, these are, by the time you're actually forming, you and your friend Ivor Davis, when you're actually coming up with Africa Pics, that company that would go on to actually produce some of the most historical, rare documentaries and historical footages that you'll never find anywhere. You are in a position at that time to also see these African leaders when they are actually being, sworn into office. And a South African writer, Peter Abrahams, wrote a book titled A Wreath for Domo, and in that book he had actually predicted that these African leaders were actually going to betray the masses, and it so turned out that it was Peter Abrahams was very prophetic, because many of them disappointed their people, apart from maybe Julius Nyerere. Some insights into these African leaders, very briefly, if you can just touch on them. Let's begin with our own founding president, Jomo Kenyatta. What kind of a man was he?
I think Jomo Kenyatta was described by the governor Renison, the leader of the darkness and death, and they quickly withdrew him, and they replaced him with Governor Malcolm MacDonald, whose father was, if I'm not mistaken, the Governor General of India, Sir I'm not sure about that, so I'll leave it out. But he was a very good governor, and he smoothed what damage was done. He repaired it, and he was so observant that he was always at the parties, at the Kenyatas and etc. and not. And he noticed that I was away, and he one day said, I'm nobody should be missing me. He came up to me and said, Mohinder, have you been away? I've not seen you for many years. He was so alert. He did a very good job smoothing after the rough job. Anyway, he moved over thing. It was a very happy transaction. And he did some very good diplomacy, which looking overall, comparing with Zimbabwe, etc., I think I've not got hard evidence, but he was the one who was responsible for. he knew that Mama was based on land hunger. He and some other people at Whitehall knew. So British came out with a very good thing. They would announce that they will buy out the white farmers. And in those days, 120 million sterling pound was a lot of money. 80 million sterling pound, second installment, etc. That was a very good diplomatic thing, which Mugabe failed to achieve. He instead grabbed. The only thing was that so they both came when Kenyatta was released. The white settlers were very nervous. So the first thing he did was, I wish you were using TV pictures, I could give you TV pictures. He went to see the white farmers, visit them in Kinangop, and then in the evening in Nakuru he addressed him meeting. Just one statement he said to them, he said, my brothers, I made mistakes, you made mistakes, you forgive me, I forgive you. Let's start with a clean slate. And that was, to me, diplomacy from the both sides, from the Kenyan side, from the British side. There was no bitterness. And then Kenyatta was a good leader to like opening of the Firestone factory, opening of this. He had a kind of a diplomacy which Uhuru has to some extent. He would open the factory and say, we welcome you to invest in this country. You make money, we make money. And this is a happy match.
Mm-hmm. So that was Jomo Kenyatta.
That was Jomo Kenyatta.
That was Jomo Kenyatta. So as a senior citizen, you saw him when he was actually being released from jail, and then he's actually given that responsibility to grow a new African nation. In your estimation, did he fail or he succeeded? Do you think that he had any blemishes?
I think he succeeded in keeping the country united. Mm-hmm. Some of these things, people were not happy of the grabbing of the lands, etc. It had started. I was reading a book about the Asian journalist when I met you by Zarina Patel. Mm-hmm. And I read a chapter, I don't know if you read it, by Salim Lone, in which he says Kenyatta addresses a public rally. He was very negative to Fred Kubai, who was another man who went to jail. I say, you fool, Fred Kubai. All of us who were in jail made money. What's wrong with you? Kind of thing. That to me was a hint of corruption. Mm-hmm. But at that time, the first leader, the founding fathers, mm-hmm. even in India, the founding father, Nehru, was heavily criticized for the things he did and the things. So but he was followed blindly, and he made many mistakes. Uh-huh. And so that's only how far can go politically. I hate politics.
You're right.
And see, but I'm quoting Salim Lone.
You're right. You are right. Of course, to be very fair, you actually say that some of the things that actually happened under President Jomo Kenyatta, people actually took advantage of his advanced age to do those bad things that we Kenyans are always complaining about today. Now, let's talk about his other colleagues in the East African community. Milton Obote, what kind of a man? Did he live up to the expectation of Ugandans?
I think he was an evil man, worse than Idi Amin, as I've been describing in my book. The power went to his head. which I recorded then the message, but we didn't use it. One day, the topmost TV journalist, Robin Day, was the topmost current affair investigative program called Panorama. He makes an appointment with Milton Obote. And so he comes to Nairobi. I join the flight. We go to Entebbe. Night before, next day, we go to the State House. We said to the secretary, we are expecting, yes, it's in the diary. So we can set up the cameras. And Obote comes in. He doesn't even look at us, goes past us.
I remember the way you describe it in the book, yes?
Yeah. And then he go past us into his office, and then we reminded the secretary, and he said to secretary, yes, I know. And she said the secretary was in a difficult situation. She knew that he was not being a nice person, but she has to obey the boss. He comes out again, then ignores us again, goes out. And then after lunch, he comes back again and goes to his office. And Robin went behind him. He says, Your Excellency, we made an appointment with you. And he says, I just broke it.
That was President Milton Obote.
That was President Milton Obote. He was so rude. I never experienced in my life. Even a Queen of England wouldn't do it. Nobody would do it. What the hell did he think he was? I mean, I was nothing at the time, but I'm still not. I mean, it's not me. It was Robin Day, the household name in England, to be selected like that. Not
and flown in actually, the appointment for the interview with the president was actually put up while he was still in London. And then he flies in, he actually gets in touch with Africa
Absolutely.
Fix. You go there and eventually that interview...
Absolutely, it was how we went without it. So this wasn't the only thing. He used to say at that time we were heavily dependent on electricity from there.
Actually, you capture that scene very well in the book when you actually seated there, actually waiting for the interview, and then you are turned away. But then you also, the way you describe President Milton Obote, his involvement in the problem that were taking advantage of the problem that were actually happening in the Congo. Is it because that sometimes we journalists we hold this very powerful pen? If somebody, you always know that you can always go back and with your pen. You actually describe him as one of those who was actually involved in those shady deals in the Congo.
Yeah, especially it came at a very bad time. We lost 3 people in Congo. Kenyan driver, a Danish cameraman,
yes,
and an Indian photographer. I was in India after the Stanleyville saga. It took me a long time
we'll come to that.
To get over it.
Yes.
But anyway, so Ivor Davis went to Uganda. No, he was making inquiries.
They had actually been given a tip that about the thing that were happening across the border. So they went. You actually sent the crew, the Africa Pix crew, to go and investigate.
That's right.
Yes, I remember the story.
Yeah. I mean, there was a smuggling of the diamond, the arms coming through from Sudan, lots of things. Which Obote was involved in the diamond thing. Only his interest was that 3 people lost. But diamond smuggling, he didn't want anybody in that area at all. And
most of all journalists.
And he was, even the Time magazine man, Peter Forbath, and the late Priya Ramrakha from Time Life at that time. He was later, Priya was later killed in Biafra, were deported from Uganda, saying because they were sniffing around, and so he was so, and
you're right.
They didn't want anybody to be around, so they said to be Ivor, if we hear from you anything more, although he wasn't in there, he was thinking of going. He said, if you step into that area. He warned indirect words, but he was born through the staff, through the other journalists, and
you're right,
etc.
Yeah, actually, Sir Mohinder actually captures, the story of this crew from Africa Pigs that were actually went there to actually investigate. They were tipped off that this smuggling of those minerals from the Congo and arms actually being taken into that country to fund the differences that were happening there. It's actually captured very well in the book. But the tragedy is that this Kenyan, that Africa Pigs crew up to today was never found. Nobody ever saw them again. And that young Swedish, journalist whom
Danish
cameraman that Sir Mohinder had actually just given a job. It's a very moving story, very emotional. But those ones who actually want to know the details of that story would actually read the book. Of course, Sir Mohinder tried to support the family of the Kenyan, the African driver who disappeared in that tragedy, by buying them 50 acres of land somewhere, at least to support the family now that the breadwinner, the father, was missing. Now, let's talk about Julius Nyerere and Haile Selassie. Julius Nyerere.
I really feel myself privileged that sometimes I feel part of the African history. I was lucky to be chosen a thing and chosen to be part of the African history, because out of picture, lots of my films and photographs are in the archives. There is a three-part documentaries on the origin of Mau and what helped to this on this film, which are in the archives, which are being shown on all the national occasions. And also I did a film on the African runners, which brought me at least a dozen awards. I was a filmmaker, but it was produced by an American company who really gave me a lot of credit, a lot of lift, and went to Ethiopia, Baby Bagila.
The sports American documentary makers of athletes.
Cappy.
Cappy.
It was a couple, Cappy and Bud Greenspan. And they only made sports films.
You're right. But of course, we actually come to that when we actually talk, very briefly touch on that. I actually want us to very briefly, of course.
Anyway, let me finish the history part of it. So, I mean, I done a lot of film. You wanted to repeat me there. That's why I was chosen to be amongst the 70 people who witnessed the history. And the MC said, Mohinder Dhillon is the most selfless amongst all this, because he never made anything himself out of it. And he's a humble man still. And he not only witnessed the history, he captured it on film and
photography,
pictures, which are being shown. So that's why. And
yes. So Julius Nyerere.
Julius Nyerere was a very honest man. I really find him in the class of the early leaders. They were all very good. I mean, we only know the leaders from the British colonies like Nkrumah and others. And I was also privileged with the early days, the formation of Organization of Africa Unity, the first meeting, the first thing. And they achieved some very good things because one of the OEU meetings, they decided, however the unfair colonial boundaries are, let's accept them. Otherwise, we'll be at each other's neck forever. My God, I felt so happy. This is an example to countries like India, who claim they got thousands of years of civilization. That's going to be Africa is setting the pace, but didn't last very long. The OEU was formed Sorry, do you want to say something? The OAU was formed and it kept together because of apartheid. That was one issue they could keep united, but otherwise they were also very good leaders. They made decisions, they did something else. Mm-hmm. The OAU then lost touch. I'm afraid the money and corruption has really destroyed OAU. Mm-hmm. The OAU started going down when Colonel Gaddafi became the chairman of the OAU. The OAU was under debt. So he wrote off all the debts, he gave them the unlimited money, and he was making an agenda to make Africa as a one country, dreaming. And we can't keep here. Anyway, the OAU resolution, then we started claiming, and Idi Amin claiming up to Navasha is a Uganda. Controversy in the Lake Victoria. Mm-hmm. What's the island called?
Migingo.
Yeah. Now that was the most stupid thing. The Kenya and Uganda got involved in it. And I offered them, I said, look, according to OAU, we are recognizing the boundary. I can go in the air, take a picture with my camera, which has got GPS. Mm-hmm. I can take pictures, and you know exactly where the boundary is, whether it's in Uganda or Kenya.
Did you give this alternative to government?
Even I writing to the newspaper, nobody publishes it. So I forgot to give. I said, what I'm banging my head against. and instead, they were both Uganda and Tanzania were blowing war horns. And this and that, they were each other's neck, and that disappointed me. Oy. They spent so much money.
Oy. Now, yes, very briefly saying there, Sir Mohinder there, the legendary TV journalist or photojournalist, actually trying to give us some insights into these African leaders, and saying that in fact when they formed the AU, the Organization of African Unity, they seemed to have an agenda, and they were so focused and visionary. But of course, things happened, corruption and all that, and somehow the OAU lost a touch. Your friendship with, this enigmatic Ethiopian emperor, Haile Selassie, what kind of a person was he?
Life is full of accidents. I became his filmmaker by accident. Emperor had 2 Englishmen as cameramen. He loved, he had 35 millimeter projection cinemas in all his palaces. After he lost his wife, he was a very lonely man, and I felt very sorry for him. He was like a prisoner of his own, or prisoner of a thing. He would want to give you an example. We covered we made a film. It was the most colorful film ever of his visit. He went to 8 countries in Far East.
That marathon trip.
And the film was so colorful. And the marathon trip, it was so colorful that we screened for him in the Jubilee Palace. Mm-hmm. And he was so excited, jumping up and down. And at the end of a long Jubilee Hall, there was a stage for the national occasions. He was entertaining people like de Gaulle or other people there.
Charles de Gaulle.
Yeah, and other leaders. And he then, down the stage, he came from a room behind it and sat with us on the thing and offered us a glass of honey wine. And his English was broken, sometimes he needed help. And was he was like an 8 years old boy, and really enjoying asking us the question. We made a very simple animation of the film, from Addis Ababa to Delhi with the arrows. Nothing complicated, but things like that excited him, and he was enjoying the conversation, sound, this, that, technical questions. We had hardly started going, and at the end of the hall, a couple of Ethiopians walked in. He had to be excused himself, because in presence of Ethiopians, he must not be seen talking to ordinary mortals like me. I said, "You poor man. Really, I didn't envy his life at all. I mean, throughout our long journeys, we are traveling in his aeroplane, playing cards, drinking champagne, pinching bottoms of the air hostesses, having one big parties continuously, and he's sitting there. He had a kind of a way of holding his thing, like you'll see, and all alone. Occasionally he will call a minister for a few minutes. Only his valet occasionally go. He rang the bell. He had converted the first class overnight. Ethiopian Airlines was a very good airline anyway. So they had a very good engineer. They would convert out a little bed and make a bedroom for him. On the long bedroom he could sleep. The only companion he had was his dog Chihuahua Lulu, who was his life. And,
his pet.
And he, just half an hour before landing, his valet would go up and put his uniforms and medals and see, he looks nice.
You also say that he was an internationalist.
Sorry?
You know, he was an internationalist.
Oh yes, he was he was representing Africa. All the other leaders were locked up at that time. Kenyatta, Nkrumah. He was the only one who kept the Africa flag flying. And Addis Ababa was like a headquarter of Africa. That's why they built OAU Hall there.
And then you also say that Ethiopia under Haile Selassie had one of these very well-trained and big military, that he would actually send even his military to go and fight in the Korean War. And
yes. One of the things, we unveiled a statue because the war between the North Korea and South Korea. A lot of Ethiopians, and they saying they held a post where every man perished, but they would not give up the post. So in their memory, they built that. They're brave soldiers.
Very brave.
Very brave soldiers.
There was no Ethiopian soldier who would actually be captured.
And Ethiopia has got a culture which is so rich. Every day the junior from his media and the press had to bow to their boss and the minister and so much.
Yes.
And he was held in awe because people will lie down on the ground when he was passing in a motorcade.
You're right. Maybe the last part of that would actually be then his fall. You had actually seen him at the height of, his leadership as an emperor representing Africa, sending, his soldiers to go and fight that, the Cold War. And then eventually he actually falls from grace. He's arrested.
He was an excellent leader for Africa. He was representing Africa internationally. This is a mistake quite a few African leaders make. He was a very good man at heart. But Ethiopia, all the land was in the hands of the few feudal landlords who kept him out of touch with the reality of his own country. I'm not saying he should not be blamed for that. Why did he give that much control to the other people? So this is no defense. But that was really his downfall. And the people, they marginally, like most of the Africa, who cares for the poor people? Under the black leadership, most of the country, everywhere, people are looting. The rich are becoming richer. The poor are becoming poorer. And so that goes on. Just put a little bit on a pressure on me that we are filming a man who's an oppressor and making a hero of him. and sometimes your conscience hurts. There's nothing I could do. Either you walk away from the contract, have your principles. We journalists come across this, but very soon the decision was made for us. And people started openly against him. The media brought his downfall. There was a British newspaper, a British filmmaker, Jonathan Dimbleby. We call him Dimbleby Famine. 84 came afterward, but just one before. He had pictures of the people dying with contrast in the palace. His cheetahs eating out of gold plates. And in my film, the airdrops, people, nimble hands, sometimes the bag will break down, and nimble hands, little children collecting little grains of wheat. At the end of the day, they got only this one, which won't make any meal at all. And they compare it, and they're competing with the birds, who are also picking on them. And so that kind of a contrast, we at that time he was already he was almost gone. The military regime did it very slowly, very cleverly or evilly, and they destroyed him bit by bit. They cut him like limb by limb, but psychologically. And he was a prisoner in the Jubilee Palace, and suddenly they are withdrawing people, etc. Except the valet, he stayed on. He was a distant relation, and he came to me, and he would. I was naturally interested in the man.
Now, yes.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, actually, I want us actually to conclude that a bit of African leaders and touch some of the most significant aspects of your career also as a journalist. You know, you actually went to the front line during the Shifter War. You know, this was a war between Kenya and Somalia, and then of course with your friend Hans Germany. A very he would actually, you know, the way you describe this German war veteran war correspondent, that he could become very emotional. In one of the incidences in the book, you actually say that at one time he was actually covering during the Second World War in Hungary, and then he saw the atrocities that were being committed by the Russians, and he put aside his notebook and everything, and he
picked up a gun from him,
and he said that he was going to fight on the side of the Hungarians. Hans Germany, you did a lot of work with him as a journalist. Do you need to go to those?
He was a Hans Germany was a correspondent for the topmost newspaper in Germany called Die Welt. He also made documentary films, offered them to the ZDF German TV and the WRD TV. And he came out with some films under complete danger. And he will expose yourself. He will expose himself and me, which I would do. Sometime I've been to the places which were too dangerous, like making of the African cavalry. We went going to a place in Mozambique, and where the chances of you getting kidnapped were 99%, and you will end up in a horrible torture. And I said to my soundman, I said, look, this is the situation, and I'm putting my life at risk, but I got no business in putting your life at risk. You can say no.
You're right.
He did, and I said yes. But we did, because I was dedicated, I wanted the sequence, and finally the Red Cross and the government will not allow me to go. So we didn't go. We found another way of doing that. Not as good, but I would give the option if it's a dangerous area. Let me talk briefly about the other leaders. My favorite leaders were like Nyerere and the Francophone countries. President Senegal.
Yeah, the poet, statesman.
He was a giant of a man, giant of a human being, giant of a leader.
Leopold Sédar Senghor
worshipped him. Even after retirement, he would walk in the streets of Dakar. He didn't want anybody to be guarding him. He said, please, don't do this. He was so much educated that the French government invited him to rewrite the French constitution in polished French. And Senegal was one country where the race relationship were at par. Under the British colonies, the white people were not allowed to be waiters.
If you are just tuning in, this is the Books Cafe on KBC English Service, and I'm your host, Khainga O'Okwemba. Our guest is the iconic TV news journalist, Sir Mohinder Dhillon. As a cameraman in the 1960s up until the 21st century, Sir Mohinder Dhillon has covered some of the most significant and historic events in modern history, more so in Africa, and he relives these events in his evocative and a poignant memoir, My Camera, My Life. Sir Mohinder has worked with some of the most remarkable journalists of his generation: Sir Robin Day, Ivor Davis, Hans Germany, Andrew Borovich, Sandy Gall, Jon Snow, Julian Munter, David Smith, yes, and Richard Vaughan, the former BBC documentary director and today managing director of Inca Africa, the documentary making company based in Nairobi, who was very gracious when we requested him to read excerpts from the memoir of his longtime friend and colleague. In this excerpt, Sir Mohinder relates his encounter with Ugandan President Idi Amin Dada as a news cameraman on the eve of an African Union summit in Kampala, Uganda, and Kenyan President Jomo Kenyatta's no-nonsense response to Idi Amin's expansionist claims over Kenya.
In June 1975, a massive consignment of Soviet-made arms destined for Uganda was impounded at the Kenyan port of Mombasa, further straining relations with Kenya. Then, in late July, at the 1975 annual summit of the OAU held in the Ugandan capital, Idi Amin assumed the OAU's rotating chairmanship, taking over from Siad Barre of Somalia. The appointment, condemned by the United Nations and by other international bodies, was also strenuously opposed by some African heads of state, including Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, and Seretse Khama of Botswana, who boycotted the summit in protest. I was in Kampala a few days before the summit, having been asked to cover the event for ITN and for WTN TV News. I'd heard that Idi Amin was planning, during the 5-day summit, to put on a spectacular display for his guests, and I wanted to find out in advance what the promised spectacle would involve, so as to be able to work out how best I might go about filming the action. The centrepiece of the show, it turned out, was to be a mock air raid to be enacted on the northern shores of Lake Victoria, south of Kampala. The enactment was intended to reflect an attack on the South African city of Cape Town, for which Idi Amin was said to be preparing. There was to be a dress rehearsal of the raid the next morning, 2 days before the OAU conference proper, and the big man himself would be attending. I could not believe my luck on finding, once the president in full military uniform and his aides had arrived and taken their seats on the huge raised platform overlooking the lake, that I was the only member of the foreign press in attendance. Jutting out into the lake from the edge of a bay far below us was Cape Town, actually an extended bank of reeds and papyrus. We'd not been waiting very long when we heard and then saw the first of the Ugandan Air Force MiG bombers flying in low as they approached their target. Then, as my camera was rolling, I noticed through the viewfinder that one of the leading MiGs was in trouble. Peeling away, the teetering plane flipped over and plunged nose first into the lake. I could hardly believe what I was filming. The other planes, all banking away sharply, aborted the mission, leaving Cape Town completely unscathed. There was a horrified silence on the podium. For several minutes, nobody moved. Then Idi Amin jumped up and stormed off, followed by his aides. Next thing, the presidential motorcade was speeding away in a cloud of dust. The Cape Town mock air raid had been a disaster, and the stunt, not surprisingly, was dropped from Kampala's official OAU Entertainment's programme, but it left me with a fabulous scoop even before the real business of the 1975 summit had begun. When I got back to the Apollo Hotel, now the Kampala Sheraton, after shipping off my film, the receptionist there told me she had an urgent message for me. "His Excellency is at our hotel swimming pool," she said, "and he would like you to go there now and film an interview with him." Alone among world leaders, Idi Amin seemed to love addressing members of the press in his swimming trunks. He had been interviewed at this same pool back in 1972, after having ordered the expulsion of Uganda's Asians. Ever the showman, Idi Amin had always cultivated assiduously the image of a clean-living, sporty, outdoors type, blessed with the common touch, as in loving nothing more than to mingle freely with ordinary people in the relaxed atmosphere of a public swimming pool. On the pool terrace, I found this strapping giant of a man, dripping wet and slumped in a deck chair in one of his obscenely tight, skimpy black bathing costumes. Perched beside him on the edge of another chair was a petite young woman, whose name turned out to be Sarah. I was about to explain to the President that while I'd be glad to film him at his leisure, a full interview might have to wait, as the reporter who was to join me for the summit had not yet arrived, when a British newspaper journalist, having seen my camera, came rushing over. Like me, he'd arrived early, and he would be delighted, he said, to pose the questions while I was filming. My footage, shipped off the same afternoon, had everybody in ITN's London cutting room in stitches of laughter. In plain view throughout, it transpired, hanging outside those skin-tight bathing trunks was Idi Amin's left testicle. I confess that I had not noticed this detail while I was filming. The footage nevertheless went on air, and was perhaps seen by Giles Foden, author of The Last King of Scotland, for there's a similar scene in the novel. "Now I'm off to get a haircut," Idi Amin announced suddenly, bringing our poolside interview to an abrupt end. "Tomorrow I'm getting married," he added, "to the lovely Sarah here." We were both invited to the wedding party, held, to my astonishment, on exactly the same platform from which, the previous day, looking out over Lake Victoria, Idi Amin and I had seen the Wayward Mig go down. No mention was made of the Cape Town bombing fiasco, or of the unfortunate pilot's death, as a jovial, carousing Idi Amin cuddled his demure, if rather reluctant, new bride, posing repeatedly for those of us with cameras, seemingly oblivious to the demands and responsibilities awaiting him next morning as host of the OAU Summit and as the OAU's next chairman. The office of OAU chairman had no moderating effect on Idi Amin, who proceeded, in February 1976, further to inflame tensions with neighbouring states by asserting that all of Kenya to the west of Gregory, eastern Rift Valley, as well as much of what is now South Sudan, belonged historically to Uganda, and so should be returned to Uganda or be reclaimed by force. Idi Amin's understanding of the historical boundary would mean expanding Uganda eastward to within 40 kilometres of Nairobi. For the government of Jomo Kenyatta, concerned already about Idi Amin's worrying stockpiling of arms in Uganda, this sweeping territorial claim amounted to the final straw. Kenya responded by blocking landlocked Uganda's supply routes through Kenya from the port of Mombasa, and by deploying troops and armoured personnel carriers at all major border crossings. The oil tankers upon which Uganda depended for its supply of fuel were prevented from entering the country. Almost overnight, all economic activity in Uganda screeched to a halt. Starved of fuel and other basic necessities, even Idi Amin's vaunted Uganda army could barely function.
And that brings us to the end of part 2 of this special series of the Books Cafe with the gentle giant of television journalism, Sir Mohinder Dhillon. Next week, we bring you the third and final part of this series. We follow Sir Mohinder in those remote and dangerous places he went on assignment. It is not normal for me to recommend a must-read book. Sir Mohinder Dhillon's My Camera, My Life is just that rare book you cannot afford not to have. I was your host, Khainga O'Okwemba. The producer of the program was Jared Ombui. Until next time, it's goodbye for now.